All right, welcome to the first video in the series from Mongrel Politics on the United States Constitution. I'm just going to jump right into it, and forgive me, you guys are probably going to spend a lot of time staring at the top of my bald head because I, like most of us, do not know our Constitution from rote memory by heart. So I am going to be basically reading to us from this, again, in bite-sized pieces. What I'm covering here in the first one, as the title card indicated, is going to be the full text of the Declaration of Independence. And so, without further ado, we're just going to get into this. So, in Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, this is why we're doing this, because the respect of the people was not being honored. We hold these, and this is the part we've probably all heard and know at least parts of. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Will have to tolerate my occasional train. But when a long train, that's good, I didn't plan that, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So, again, in real time, I'm just summarizing here that basically what this portion of the Declaration of Independence is saying is that first of all, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that everyone is created equally, that we all have the right, the God-given right, just by existing, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that whenever a government is destructive to that, to the individual's pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, that the governed people have a right to question and throw off the constraints of that government and establish a new government. But the other point that I thought was extremely, that is something worth paying attention to, which is the point where it says, let me come back here, prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And what that is saying is that this is not a choice that you make lightly, that you consider very carefully. If you are going to do that. I know there have been some people who have talked about us having a new constitutional Congress, which for those of you who are unaware, that is basically we the people saying, okay, our current government is tyrannical and we're going to have a new one. And I have looked into that, and the mechanisms by which that is done requires that a number of different states and their representatives all get on board with it. And this is something we have talked about in our longer form podcast, that you both have frustrated citizens who have called for this, but you also have some people who are fairly well connected and are sitting in what we could call economic elites who have called for it. And I definitely understand the frustration of people who work for a living with our current government and the way things are going. But I personally really do not think that this is something that we should be considering at this point in time, because just like with our own Declaration of Independence and the formation of our own country, it was not the sharecropper, it was not the Native American, it was not the indentured servant or the simple shopkeeper who wrote the Constitution and established these laws. It was their version of the 1%. It was the wealthy landowners who wrote it. And we're currently living in a time when, I will die on this hill, that the economic elites that sit astride our world and have purchased our politicians and own our media organizations are largely responsible for the discontent that the vast majority of American people feel, whether you're on the left or on the right. And if we were to have a constitutional Congress right now, those are the people that would be writing the new constitutional Congress. It wouldn't be the welder. It wouldn't be the plumber. It wouldn't be the waitress. It wouldn't be the doctor, right? It would be the investment banker. It would be the CEO sitting at the board of directors who would be writing the new ones. And I think we could all agree that might not be good. But moving on. So now they're basically going to say, they're saying that the king has established a long history of basically treating the people like crap. And so here is, as they say, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So here are the list of grievances that they had with the king at the time. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So in other words, he's ignoring law. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be attained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. So not only has he not followed established laws, he has refused the governors. Let's say there was a problem in the colonies that needed addressing, and the governors were like, hey, can we please establish this law to help keep these people happy or correct for this issue? And he refused to grant his consent to them. So he basically tied the hands of the people who were supposed to be doing governing on his behalf. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those peoples would relinquish the right of representation in legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. In other words, the only way he would allow any laws to be passed was if the governed people gave up any right to representation. And they make the point that the right was whatever rights or representation those people had was extremely important and necessary for them, and that the only people who would really have a problem with any of these laws or rules being passed were tyrants. So basically, they're saying he's a tyrant. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. In other words, he's like, okay, fine, we can get together and talk, but we're going to make you jump through a million hoops, and we're going to make sure that it's so burdensome and so difficult that basically people really have to invest a lot and really be very committed to something. It's as if saying, sure, fine, you can come and vote, but you have to cross this pit of alligators, and you have to walk this tightrope, and you have to juggle 5 poodles while standing on 1 foot and singing the national anthem in reverse, and then I'll sit down and talk to you. A bit of a ridiculous example, but I think you get the point. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of people. Let me read that again so I make sure I understand. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly. So in other words, houses of representation of the people or the stakeholders, for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of people. In other words, there were legislative groups or governmental bodies formed by the people, and he has dissolved them because they were basically being stubborn and saying, no, what you're asking for is unreasonable, it is burdensome, and we're not going to do it. And so he would basically say, you guys don't exist, you don't have a right, we don't acknowledge you anymore. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected. Basically, after getting rid of these representatives, he basically prevented new representatives from being elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. In other words, disillusioning any governmental authority or body that could either, at that time, I'm guessing, keep them safe from invasion from either France or from Native Americans who were aggressive and wanted to kick the pilgrims off the land, or the settlers off the land that they were taking. But the issue here being that he refused to, again, it was another evidence of him being unresponsive to not only the will and the desire of the people, but also the people's needs for safety and security. He has, while fomenting or not doing anything to deal with unrest or difficulty or discontent within the populace. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriation of lands. So basically, that seems like a procedural thing, but it definitely seems like a grievance. Let's say somebody came here for trade purposes, and in order to conduct their business, they would need to become a naturalized resident of the colonies, and he basically got in the way of that. And as it says here, and refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. So basically moving the bar of taking possession or ownership of lands that could then be worked for whatever, for, if you were going to raise horses, or if you were going to be a blacksmith, or if you were going to farm crops to feed the population. Basically, the king kept getting in the way of people doing that freedom to engage in economic activity. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. In other words, he's gotten in the way of local judges and like constables, or I'm not sure what the term was at that point in time, but basically law enforcement, to try cases and to basically to administer justice, and without the law enforcement or any form of a judicial branch being present, then it's really difficult to hold criminals accountable. So moving on, he has made judges dependent upon his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. So in other words, judges had no independent judgment. They basically were just mouthpieces for the king, and if they went against what the king wanted or desired, then they basically could lose their salaries or their appointment just because he disagreed with their point of view. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their sustenance. In other words, he sent a bunch of unaccountable soldiers and agents, the tax collectors or inspectors or whatever it was, to basically burden the people and harass the people, and of course sending all these people to newly formed colonies that were still trying to build up the capacity to feed their own people, and now you have hundreds upon hundreds or maybe possibly thousands of bureaucrats coming over and eating the very food that the populace needed to eat. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, basically having standing armies in the street with no real job to do because it's a time of peace, which now you've got a bunch of guys whose job it is to stand around in case something happens, and they're going to get bored and they're probably going to harass people. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. In other words, the soldiers that were here were not in any way responsive or did not have any mandate to protect or defend the people. Their sole mandate was to do whatever it is the king wished, whether that was good for the people or not. He has combined with others to subject us to jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. And under this, it has a couple of categories. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, in other words, large bodies of troops maybe from other countries, that basically saying, hey, you got to put these guys up, you got to feed them, you got to give them a place to sleep, which is, again, a burden on the people they did not ask for and probably caused problems. For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit and the inhabitants of these states. Again, coming back to what I was saying, you have these standing armies with nothing to do but stand around. And at that point in time, they've got all the guns, they've got all the power. And so, we know, this is a book I recommend, The People's History of the United States. We are among one of the most civilized times in human history. And there are no shortage of stories about the conduct of soldiers from any nation, England, Spain, the Dutch, to the people that lived in those areas and those places in their times. It was incredibly, if I went on at length about the stories that I know happened during those times, whether it was to just farmers and peasants, to natives at various things, there's no way YouTube would probably get the video taken down because some pretty horrible things happen. And so imagine you've got these troops who are badgering wives and daughters or brutalizing the citizens of this nation. And then, as they said here, for protecting them by a mock trial, and basically just a trial that was just there for show. It wasn't actually looking for justice. But by protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. And in this term, murders means more than just like ending somebody's lives. It is all the other harassments that come along. So for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. And so basically like constraining the United States colonies, you can only trade with the King of England. It doesn't matter if the King of England maybe didn't want to buy what you were producing or making, and let's say a French or a Dutch trade ship came by, you were not legally allowed to sell your wares or your surplus goods to them because the king forbid it from thousands of miles away. Moving on, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. The Boston Tea Party, that was just them levying taxes upon people just because they, and to the large extent at that point in time in history, taxes were levied against colonies, not necessarily to support the colony, but to support their imperialist and expansionist endeavors all over the world. So they would be collecting taxes from the American colonies to support their troops and arming their troops in, say, India at that time, or in Africa, because they were expanding over there as well. So again, taxation without representation. We've all heard that before. for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. In other words, depriving the citizens of the colonies a fair trial. So you've got the military, as we discussed earlier, could do whatever they want and they would get a fake trial and there was no justice delivered. But then there would be kangaroo courts for us, where it was not a jury trial conducted by a jury of your peers. It was one of the king's judges who, if we go back, remember, the judges could lose their standing, their position, or their pay simply by not enacting the will of the king. And so here, if just a regular old person like you or me was accused of being a thief or whatever, that the trials were more often than not really fair, and it was just some dude with a powdered face and a wig going, yes, off with his head. Yeah, like I said, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretend offenses. Again, this kind of comes back to the sort of lack of actual justice or trial without sufficient evidence or any sort of process that was followed. Because as I said, for transporting us beyond seas, what basically means taking people back to England and tried for pretended offenses. And at that point in time, travel from the colonies back to England it's not like hopping on a jet plane and flying from LA to New York. Like, many people died. It was pretty perilous, and it took a tremendous amount of time. So yanking somebody off of the colony streets, off of, from North America, for pretended offenses, in other words, something they didn't have evidence for, they just didn't like this person, or there was some reason the king wanted to make a show of this person, they could toss them on a boat and bring them back to England and try them. And again, was not necessarily going to be a fair trial, adjudicated by a jury of peers or anything. So the legal system was not as good as it is these days. So, I mean, that was a huge burden to place on somebody, because then let's say, it probably didn't happen very often, but let's say they were like, okay, guess what? You weren't guilty. Good luck getting back to the colonies. Now you're stuck in England again. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. So the way I'm interpreting this is that there was some system of laws that was typical in England, and the king apparently was going into a region. Let's say it was a small part of what is now Massachusetts, and the king would send their troops in and basically get rid of the system of laws, and then establishing basically a police state, an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries. So to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. So in other words, you got one area that's really sort of getting the short end of the stick, and they're about fed up with it. And so they would send in the troops, establish martial law, kind of take over that region, basically sending the message, if you don't do exactly what the king says, that doesn't mean it. We don't care if it means you're going to starve to death or your babies are going to die. We're going to send the troops in and we're going to implement martial law. And sending that message to any place else within the colonies that if you don't do exactly as the king likes, we're going to send our troops in and get rid of the laws and you'll be under martial law there. Moving on, for taking away our charters, which is basically a permit to do business. Taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. So basically, doing away with any legal framework for doing business, abolishing laws, could be any law, abolishing any law, period, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. So that's where they talk about like going in and taking away the right of a governing body, let's say a town council, be like, you know what, we don't like what you're doing, we're absolving your town council. So basically just doing whatever they want, whatever the king willed to the citizens of the colonies. Moving on, for suspending our own legislatures, again, abolishing the governing bodies that we had on the colonies, and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So I think you're getting the sense here that basically if we had any rights, if we had any system of laws, if we had any system of legal judgment or any ability to do self-governance in our colonies, at the whim of the king, at the stroke of a pen, that could all be wiped away. And so these are just some of the grievances they're listing. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. So abdicate basically means give up. He's given up government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. So if I'm not mistaken, at that time, at the time that we declared our independence, I believe England was fighting France, and the colonies had, requested garrisons and troops here to defend us should the French troops come marauding. Now, as history knows, it went very differently, because after we declared our independence and basically started our Revolutionary War, France came to our aid. Now, one could say they did it out of the goodness of their heart, and maybe some of that is true, but I think also it's entirely possible that they saw it as a wise strategic move, because if the English government was fighting the French over there in Europe and on the high seas, it wasn't doing the English government any favors to also be fighting us on our shores, right? So it stretched their resources thin by getting our back. But basically what the Declaration of Independence is saying is that, like, you won't even defend us from foreign invaders, and has refused his protection, and in fact has waged war against us. And now it goes on to say, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, dissolution, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. So in other words, they're pointing out right here that I'm going to guess there was civil unrest within our population at that time. And so instead of sending maybe slightly more disciplined British troops, he was sending large armies of foreign mercenaries over here to complete the works of death, as they say. And basically, because they were simply mercenaries and they were probably paid for every rebelling head that they could end, that they were particularly cruel. They had nothing in common, unlike our own military forces. They come from our communities. They are us. We are the same people. And so by using mercenaries from all over the world, they have no identification with us, and therefore they have no reservations about visiting cruelty and harm upon us. So moving on, he has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. Basically, if we had ships out on the ocean, the British would take those ships and take what would eventually become American citizens and say, you're now going to line up with our troops as an extra, I don't know, like a bullet sponge, and you're going to go and we're going to bring you onto American shores to attack your own friends, your own family, your own community, and if you don't, we're just going to end you. So, I mean, that's pretty cruel stuff there. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages who's like, and this is stuff that was written in 1776, so I think we're beyond that language, but this is the text of it. Let me start that over. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, so that's just basically saying, fomenting dissent within us so that we could not present a unified front against him, either bribing or coercing citizens of the colonies to turn on their own neighbors and brothers in defense of the king. And maybe some of them believed in the king, but then it goes beyond that to say, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So basically, through whatever means necessary, inspiring or promoting or incentivizing the natives, who were probably not too happy with us at that point, to basically come into towns and villages and murder everyone. Because that was yet one more mechanism. So now you've got this point, like not only does he not respect our right to self-govern or rule ourselves, not only are any semblance of a judicial system that exists in the colonies at that point in time completely beholden to him and his will, and have to do his bidding no matter what, forbidding us from trading with anyone other than him, basically sieging us on the high seas, taking our own people captive and forcing them to take up arms against us, going to the natives out on the frontier and saying, go and murder these. I mean, just this king, he just sounds like a real jerk. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose charter is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. In other words, it didn't matter how nicely we asked, how patient we were, how much we begged and we pled. The guy just turned around and flipped us the bird and said, I'll do whatever the hell I want, I own you. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of, that is a word I have never seen, consanguinity. We can look that up. It's consanguinity. I told you, we're doing this together here. But the way I interpret this is that basically, the colonies were largely composed of folks that came over from England, and they had friends and they had family and they had connections back in England. And it sounds like that they wrote them letters, they had correspondence with them, and they basically pled to them, listen, the king is not listening to us. He's treating us like a real asshat. Can you guys appeal? Can you guys please do something? And the way I read this is it basically about, hey, you guys went there. You guys chose your lot. Good luck with that. We're not doing anything for you. So they say, we must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold on them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. Yeah, you heard that right. I'm going to interpret that. Basically, that means is that we must therefore acquiescence, which basically means to give up, in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. Basically saying, listen, if you're not going to do anything for us, we have no choice but to consider you enemies and therefore war. But if you will have peace with us, we will consider you our friends. That's one sentence. I'm not going to get hung up on it because that's that old-timey lingo that we're probably going to stumble over from time to time because language evolves over time and they will use terminology and phraseology that's not really relevant today. So even the best read person is going to stumble over their funny old-timey speak. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as a free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So that, my friends, is the United States Declaration of Independence, interspersed with a little bit of context about what was going on at that time. That you basically had an overreaching authoritarian government that did not respect the will of the people, where justice was metered out without any sense of consistency, without any sense of true justice. It was all based on the will and the whim of the most powerful in the land. And that is not justice. When justice is metered out based on who has the power, that is tyranny. When justice is metered out based on measured reason and facts and evidence, well, now you begin to approach justice. So, there comes a time when people said enough is enough is enough. And, when you go through this, you're talking about being restricted of trade, being restricted of free movement, being restricted of any sense of justice or self-representation, or even being able to organize as individual communities to deal with issues or problems that they were left undefended from foreign enemies, be that French, the French, or be it the Native Americans, or whatever it was, that they were not protected, and that resources and taxation was extracted from them without any consent, without any governing body beyond the will of the king. And it got to that point where this country said enough is enough. We all we have a God-given, inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it certainly sounds, based on the list of grievances and our own Declaration of Independence, that the king had zero regard for that. It had zero regard for those inalienable rights for all people to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that sums up the first episode here of this, and that is the United States Declaration of Independence from 1776. Thank you very much for watching, and go America.